The story takes place in the summer of 2004, during one of my regular escapes to the local state park. The morning air held that particular quality unique to early summer, crisp enough to remind you of spring, but warming with the promise of afternoon heat. A thin mist clung to the valleys below as I navigated the winding mountain roads, my old Subaru's engine humming contentedly as we climbed higher into the wilderness that had become my sanctuary. The familiar scent of pine needles and mountain sage drifted through my open windows, a natural perfume that never failed to ease the tension from my shoulders. The hour-long drive to the park went as smoothly as it had hundreds of times before, my weathered vehicle handling the serpentine curves with practiced ease, each turn and switchback as familiar as an old friend's smile. After parking near the ranger station, a weathered building that had become as familiar as my own home, I notified the on-duty ranger of my plans. Paul, the usual morning shift ranger, nodded with recognition as he logged my information, his weathered face creasing into the familiar smile I'd come to expect during these morning check-ins. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency as he noted my intended route and expected return time, the same ritual we'd performed countless times before. One last-minute check of my pack, water, first aid kit, trail mix, extra layers, and I began my 2-mile hike to my regular campsite. Little did I know at that moment, one person's life had just taken a grim turn, and I was soon to follow. My interest in the outdoors started just after the attacks of September 11th, born from the darkest period of my life. Although not personally present at any of the attack targets, I did lose someone very close to me, Catherine, my college sweetheart. We had met during our sophomore year at Columbia University, both of us struggling through organic chemistry and finding solace in our shared love of classical music and contemporary art. Our first date had been at a tiny Vietnamese restaurant in the East Village, where we talked until the owner practically had to shoo us out at closing time. Those early days were filled with the kind of magic that only exists in new love, stolen kisses between classes, long walks through Central Park, endless conversations about our dreams for the future. We had drifted apart after graduation, our careers pulling us in different directions. She to a prestigious consulting firm in Manhattan, me to a research position in Boston. But the early days of social media had allowed us to reconnect, tentative messages growing into long email exchanges, and eventually late-night phone calls that stretched into the early morning hours. Those weeks before the attacks had been filled with cautious hope as we carefully rebuilt our connection, rediscovering the easy companionship that had made our college years so special. We were planning on meeting for Thanksgiving, cautiously discussing the renewal of our relationship. Both of us older now, and perhaps wiser, ready to explore what we might become together. The news of her death in the North Tower left me hollow, a shell of myself. She had been attending an early morning meeting on the 97th floor, just another Tuesday that turned into something unimaginable. I learned later that she had called her mother in those final moments, her last words full of love and courage even in the face of the unthinkable. I was beyond distraught upon getting the news, and immediately began planning my own death, seeing no way forward in a world without her in it. The color seemed to drain from everything around me, leaving only shades of gray and the crushing weight of loss. I got as far as packing a bag and hiking out to the spot I'd chosen, a dramatic overlook where the mountains seemed to touch the sky, the perfect place for a final goodbye. The late autumn wind whipped around me as I stood at the edge, my mind clouded with grief and despair. Something happened when I got there, though, something I still struggled to put into words. The beauty of the place overcame me, breaking through my grief like sunlight through storm clouds. Despite the utter grief I felt, the serenity I found on that mountain changed my mind. The wind in the pines, the distant cry of hawks, the endless expanse of sky. It spoke to something deeper than my pain, something eternal and unchanging that would continue long after all our human sorrows had passed. My grieving process would continue for many months, but I had found my medicine. At any point I felt too overwhelmed, I fled back into nature, and all was made bearable again. The mountains became my therapist, the wilderness my healing ground. Every trail I hiked, every summit I reached, helped piece my shattered self back together. The physical exertion of climbing helped exhaust my body enough that sleep would finally come, while the sublime views from mountain peaks reminded me that beauty still existed in the world. So now we're back in the summer of 2004, when these retreats had become as natural as breathing, as essential to my well-being as food or water. Nothing of note occurred that first evening. I made camp with practiced efficiency, the familiar routine of setting up my tent and organizing my gear bringing its own kind of peace. The site was nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering ponderosa pines, their reddish bark glowing like copper in the evening light. A family of mule deer grazed cautiously at the clearing's edge, their ears twitching at every sound. I enjoyed a simple dinner of dried soup and crackers while watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose, the changing light creating shadow plays across the ancient rock faces. The night was clear and cool, perfect for stargazing, and I spent several hours identifying constellations, remembering nights spent on the Columbia University campus with Catherine, making up our own stories about the stars. I fell asleep to the gentle rustle of wind through the trees, feeling more at home than I ever did in my apartment in the city. The next morning dawned clear and promising, the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive. I considered my options over coffee, savoring the bitter warmth as I watched the sun slowly illuminate the canyon depths. A pair of golden eagles soared overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. I chose to hike down into the canyons, where erosion often exposed artifacts from the area's ancient inhabitants. These excursions had yielded a few stone points for my ever-growing collection, carefully documented and eventually turned over to the Park Service. Each piece a tangible connection to the people who had called these canyons home centuries before. I knocked back some oatmeal and took to the trail, the morning sun at my back, my boots crunching rhythmically against the rocky path. The trail wound down through layers of geological history, each stratum telling its own story of ancient seas, prehistoric forests, and long-vanished deserts. The morning light played across the rock faces, bringing out subtle variations in color, deep reds, warm oranges, cool grays, and occasional streaks of purple and green, where different minerals had left their mark. Almost halfway down the cliffside, a glint of light caught my eye, like a mirror flash but more erratic, something that didn't belong in this natural setting. I couldn't locate the source immediately, squinting against the brightness that seemed to dance across the rocky surface. Soon another flash blinded me momentarily, but this time I recovered quickly enough to catch sight of something that made my heart stop. A pair of arms flailing desperately about 50 feet further down the cliffside. The morning silence was broken by a faint cry for help, the sound almost lost in the vastness of the canyon. I jogged further down the trail, trying to keep my eyes on the spot where I'd seen the movement, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The loose gravel shifted treacherously under my boots, small cascades of stones tumbling down into the canyon below. There was a rocky outcrop off to the side that seemed to offer a better vantage point, jutting out from the main trail like a natural observation deck. Without thinking through the consequences, I jumped onto it, my focus entirely on reaching the source of those desperate cries. I could instantly feel it beginning to give way under my feet, the loose shale crumbling like stale cake beneath my boots. The sound of rock giving way filled my ears, a terrible grinding screech followed by the hollow boom of falling stone. The fall felt like an eternity, though it probably lasted only seconds. a blur of sky and rock as gravity took hold. Time seemed to slow down, allowing my mind to catalog every sensation. The rush of air past my face, the acrid taste of dust in my mouth, the weightless feeling in my stomach. I gritted my teeth in preparation for severe pain, but it wasn't as bad as I'd feared, thanks to my backpack absorbing some of the impact. The landing knocked the wind from my lungs, leaving me gasping like a landed fish. Surveying my position from the flat of my back, I saw that I had only gone about 20 feet. Luck had placed me on a relatively stable ledge, though loose rocks continued to rain down around me for several seconds after my landing. I rested there for a moment or two until the initial shock wore off, and I remembered what had brought me here. The dust slowly settled around me, revealing a precarious position on the narrow ledge. I tried to stand, only to realize my left foot was wedged between two large rocks, trapped like a bear in a steel trap. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but my outdoor training kicked in. Stay calm, assess the situation, take deliberate action. I forced myself to take several deep breaths, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs. I pushed on the top rock and simultaneously pulled my leg, feeling the stone scrape against my boot, the sound of grinding rock setting my teeth on edge. I got just enough space to drag my leg free, relief flooding through me as I wiggled my toes and found everything still working, though tender and likely bruised. I returned to my feet and looked around for the rest of the person I'd seen. Through the settling dust, I saw a woman laying almost motionless off to my right, her body awkwardly splayed across the rocky ground, one arm bent at an unnatural angle that made my stomach turn. Her hiking clothes were torn and dirty, suggesting she'd been there for some time. A high-end camera lay shattered nearby, explaining the flashes that had caught my attention. I carefully picked my way down the cliffside until I reached her, each step calculated to avoid triggering another rock slide. She looked dead initially, her face pale against the dark rock, streaked with dirt and what appeared to be dried blood. But then her lips began moving, forming silent words. I kneeled down beside her and began speaking in the calmest voice I could manage, drawing on years of wilderness first aid training. "I'm here to help," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Try not to move. Can you tell me your name?" Her eyes slowly opened, and surprisingly a smile grew on her face, transforming her pained expression into something almost peaceful. "I thought you were dead when I saw that rock collapsed," she whispered. Her voice was scratchy yet kind, incongruously gentle given the circumstances. "I hate to be a bother, mister, but you wouldn't happen to have any water, would you?" I hastily dug through my pack for my Nalgene bottle, thanking whatever impulse had made me fill it before leaving camp. The bottle was a little dented from my fall but showed no leaks, the water inside sloshing reassuringly. Slowly and carefully, I placed the opening to her lips and poured a small amount in, remembering my first aid training about the dangers of giving too much water too quickly to an injured person. For the next few minutes, we spoke about how she ended up there. She had been hiking alone, taken a shortcut that looked promising, lost her footing on the loose rock. Her name was Michelle, she told me between sips of water, and she'd been trying to photograph the sunrise over the canyon when she fell. Her story came out in bits and pieces, between sips of water punctuated by grimaces of pain. She was a professional photographer from Vermont, out here on assignment for a nature magazine. She'd arrived before dawn, hoping to catch the first light hitting the canyon walls. The shortcut had looked deceptively stable in the pre-dawn light. I would occasionally pour a little more water into her mouth, watching her face carefully for signs of nausea or increasing pain. She was obviously in a great deal of pain, each breath coming with a slight wheeze that worried me, suggesting possible internal injuries. I knew the longer I wasted talking, the longer she was from medical help. After explaining my plan to get help, I covered her with a fleece from my pack to protect against shock, tucking it carefully around her body while avoiding moving her more than necessary. The morning sun was growing stronger now, and I worried about the heat that would soon fill the canyon. Before leaving, I rigged up a makeshift sunshade using my emergency blanket and some climbing cord, hoping it would offer some protection from the increasingly harsh sunlight. Climbing back up the loose rocky hill was harder than coming down, especially now that I was beginning to feel the effects of my own fall. My back screamed in protest with each step, and my left ankle throbbed inside my boot, sending shooting pains up my leg with every movement. At first I attempted a hobbling type of run, but my knees wouldn't allow it, the pain too intense to maintain any speed. Instead, I settled on a fast walk, each step deliberate and careful. A slow rescuer, I reminded myself, was better than another victim. The sun beat down mercilessly as I made my way up the trail, sweat soaking through my shirt and stinging my eyes. The journey was long and painful, but I reached the ranger's post at just after 12:45 p.m., my clothes soaked with sweat and my body trembling with exhaustion. Paul was still on duty, and to his credit, he had a rescue team assembled within minutes of my breathless explanation. The park's emergency response protocols kicked into high gear. Radios crackled with coordinates and medical terminology. Rescue gear was quickly assembled, and a helicopter was dispatched from the nearest medical center. While they mobilized to help Michelle, the park medic insisted on checking me over, his practiced hands finding injuries I hadn't even noticed in my adrenaline-fueled state. He eventually called an ambulance for both of us, my protests overruled by concerns about internal injuries and the possibility of spinal damage from my fall. The wait was excruciating. I sat in the ranger station, ice packs strapped to various parts of my body, listening to the radio chatter as the rescue team worked to reach Michelle. The helicopter arrived about an hour after I'd made it back, its rotors throwing up clouds of dust as it touched down in the designated landing zone. The pilot reported difficult conditions, gusty winds and tight quarters making the rescue particularly challenging. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they announced they had her secured and were beginning the airlift. I had to settle for an ambulance ride and an overnight stay in the hospital, my protests overruled by concerns about internal injuries. The doctors found 3 cracked ribs and a severely sprained ankle, along with an impressive collection of cuts and bruises. The emergency room was a blur of x-rays, Connecticut scans, and medical personnel asking the same questions over and over. I think it was almost 6 p.m. when I saw the ER staff rolling Michelle in, and the wait wasn't over, unfortunately. She had been taken into emergency surgery soon after arriving, and several hours would pass until I'd heard anything. When the news finally arrived, it was good. In spite of having a punctured lung, a concussion, a broken arm, and assorted other injuries, she would go on to make a full recovery. The following weeks were filled with physical therapy appointments and follow-up visits. Michelle and I kept in touch throughout our recovery, sharing war stories and comparing healing progress. Her husband flew in from Vermont, a quiet, steady presence who seemed to fill any room he entered. They had been married just 6 months, he told me one evening over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. And this assignment was supposed to be her last solo trip before they started trying for a family. I watched their reunion from my hospital bed, struck by the tender way he stroked her hair and the tears that flowed freely down both their faces. My own recovery was slower than I would have liked, but the enforced rest gave me time to reflect on the strange parallels in my life. Once again, the mountains that might have claimed a life had instead granted a reprieve. The physical therapist, a cheerful woman named Rosa, became my guide through the long process of rebuilding strength and flexibility. She had a way of pushing me just hard enough, knowing exactly when to encourage and when to enforce rest. During one particularly frustrating session, when I was struggling with a simple exercise that should have been easy, she shared her own story of recovery from a climbing accident. Her words stayed with me. "The mountain teaches us patience. whether we want the lesson or not. Michelle's path to recovery was longer but ultimately successful. The doctors had warned about possible complications from the punctured lung, but her determination and youth worked in her favor. She approached physical therapy with the same perfectionist attention to detail that she brought to her photography, methodically working through each exercise and carefully documenting her progress. 6 months after the accident, she sent me a photograph she'd taken from the exact spot where she'd fallen, this time safely harnessed and accompanied by a park guide. The image went on to win a national award, though she always insisted the story behind it was better than the photograph itself. The years since have brought many changes. Michelle did return to photography, though she now specializes in studio work and controlled environments. Her husband James got his wish. They now have twin daughters who share their mother's artistic eye and their father's steady nature. They send me a Christmas card every year, always including a family photo and an update on their lives. The girls are in middle school now, both members of their school's rock climbing team, much to their mother's mixed delight and anxiety. As for me, I still visit the mountains regularly, though I'm more cautious now, more aware of both their beauty and their dangers. The Park Service invited me to join their volunteer rescue team, and I've helped train new rangers in wilderness first aid. Sometimes during these training sessions, I take the recruits to the spot where Michelle fell. The rock slide changed the terrain somewhat, but you can still see the ledge where I landed, now adorned with sparse vegetation pushing through the cracks in the stone. It serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly conditions can change in the wilderness, and how thin the line can be between tragedy and triumph. Last summer, I received a special piece of mail, an invitation to Michelle's daughter's bat mitzvah celebration. The ceremony was being held in Vermont, and the invitation included a personal note asking me to share the story of their mother's rescue as part of the service. Standing there in the synagogue, looking out at the gathered family and friends, I was struck by how many lives were touched by what happened that day in the canyon. Michelle's daughters, who might never have been born, the countless people who've seen her photographs, the rangers I've helped train, the other hikers they've gone on to rescue. Sometimes I think about how close both of us came to dying in those mountains, and how instead we both found reasons to live there. Life has a funny way of coming full circle like that, of turning our darkest moments into opportunities for grace. The wilderness that almost claimed Michelle's life had saved mine years before, and in saving her, I felt I had repaid some cosmic debt. The mountains remain my sanctuary, but now they hold different meanings. Not just a place of solace and healing, but a reminder of the surprising ways our lives intersect and the strength we find in helping others. Catherine's memory remains with me, of course, but it's softened now, like a photograph gently faded by time. I've learned that grief, like the mountains themselves, changes over time, weathered by the elements but never truly disappearing. The pain that once drove me to that cliff top has transformed into something else, something that helps me recognize and reach out to others in their own moments of crisis. Every time I lace up my hiking boots, I carry with me the lessons learned from both Catherine and Michelle, that life is precious, that help can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the darkest moments can lead us to our greatest purpose. The mountain trails have taught me that every journey has its purpose, even if we can't see it at the time. Some days, I'm still that grieving young man standing at the cliff's edge, and other days I'm the rescuer reaching out to help. But mostly, I'm just another hiker on the trail, grateful for each step, each breath, each moment of beauty and challenge that the mountains provide. The path ahead still holds its mysteries, but I face them now with the quiet confidence of one who has learned that even in our darkest hours, we're never truly alone on the trail. I've always found peace in nature, even as a kid growing up in suburban Massachusetts. While other children spent their weekends glued to video game consoles, I was the odd one out who begged my parents to take me to the state parks. I'd spend hours collecting leaves, following animal tracks, and imagining myself as some kind of modern-day explorer. My mom used to joke that I was born in the wrong century, that I should have been one of those early naturalists documenting newfound species in leather-bound journals. This connection to nature only grew stronger as I got older. Through high school and college, I joined hiking clubs, learned wilderness survival skills, and spent every spare moment on trails. It wasn't just about exercise or adventure. Nature became my therapy, my reset button whenever life got overwhelming. The steady rhythm of my boots on a dirt path, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant calls of birds. These simple things could calm my racing thoughts like nothing else. That's actually how I met Casey. It was during a group hike organized by our local outdoor recreation club. She stood out immediately, not just because of her bright blue hiking backpack or her easy smile, but because she shared that same deep connection to the wilderness. While others in the group were snapping selfies or complaining about the lack of cell service, Casey was pointing out different bird calls and identifying wildflowers along the trail. We clicked immediately. Our first date wasn't dinner and a movie. It was a sunrise hike followed by coffee from our thermoses at the summit. Over the next 4 years, we built our relationship on these shared adventures. Every weekend became an opportunity to explore a new trail, discover a hidden waterfall, or watch the sunset from some remote peak. We mapped out our future through conversations on these hikes. Our dream of a small cabin in the mountains, our plans to eventually hike the entire Appalachian Trail together, our agreement that we'd rather spend money on adventures than on having kids. Casey was different from anyone I'd ever dated. She had this infectious enthusiasm for life that drew people to her, but she was also deeply thoughtful. She believed in science and logic, but also maintained this fascinating openness to the mysterious and unexplained. While I was busy trying to identify plant species or calculate our elevation gain, she'd be spinning tales about the local legends or wondering aloud about what secrets the forest might be keeping. I found her perspective refreshing. It added a sense of magic to our adventures without detracting from the real wonders of nature. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to her stories about the supernatural. Maybe then I would have been better prepared for what happened that day, 8 years ago, on what should have been just another hike. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about how that day began, about the small decisions that led us into something I still struggle to explain. It started like any other Saturday morning. I remember waking up early before my alarm, excited about exploring a new trail we'd discovered online. The weather forecast showed clear skies, but with a slight chance of afternoon showers. Typical New England spring weather. Casey always teased me about my obsessive planning, but I'd learned through experience that preparation could make the difference between a great adventure and a miserable one. The trail we'd chosen was about 2 hours from our apartment, in a less traveled section of state forest. I'd spent the previous evening studying topographic maps, reading trail reviews, and plotting our route. Most hikers stuck to the main loop trail, but I'd noticed a promising spur trail that led to what looked like an overlook. The reviews were sparse for this section, which only made it more intriguing to us. We loved finding those less traveled paths. I packed with our usual thoroughness: first aid kit, extra layers, headlamps, water filtration system, and enough trail mix and energy bars to last well beyond our planned hiking time. Something made me throw in our camping gear too: a small 2-person tent, sleeping bags, and basic overnight supplies. Casey raised an eyebrow when she saw me loading the extra equipment into the car. "Planning on getting us lost?" she joked, helping me arrange the gear in the trunk. "Just being prepared," I replied. "You never know what might happen, and I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it." She smiled and kissed my cheek. This is why I keep you around, my own personal Boy Scout. The drive out was peaceful. We left early enough to avoid most traffic, and as the suburbs gave way to increasingly dense forest, we fell into one of our comfortable conversations about the future. Casey was particularly animated that morning, talking about her ideas for our wedding. She wanted something small, outdoors of course, maybe even on top of a mountain. I remember thinking how lucky I was, how perfectly our lives seemed to fit together. If only I'd known then how that day would change everything. We reached the trailhead around 9 a.m. The parking lot was empty except for a single pickup truck, which didn't surprise us given how remote the location was. The morning air had that crisp spring feeling, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As we shouldered our packs and double-checked our gear, I remember feeling that familiar surge of excitement that came with starting a new trail. The first mile was everything we'd hoped for. The path wound through old-growth forest, the canopy so thick in places that it created a natural cathedral effect, with shafts of sunlight breaking through like stained glass. Casey pointed out various wildflowers, trillium, jack-in-the-pulpit, and early spring beauties. We stopped often to take photos or examine interesting fungi growing on fallen logs. Our conversation flowed easily, as it always did on these hikes. We talked about work. Casey had recently started a new position at an environmental nonprofit. About our plans to maybe buy a house in the next year. About the camping trips we wanted to take that summer. Looking back, I can still hear the sound of her laugh echoing through the trees as she told me about her coworker's disastrous attempt at office composting. But somewhere around the second mile, something began to change. I noticed it gradually at first, the way the bird song seemed to fade out, replaced by an unusual stillness. The air felt heavier somehow, more dense, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I remember checking our location on the map, making sure we hadn't somehow strayed from the marked trail. "Does something feel different to you?" I asked Casey, trying to keep my voice casual. She paused, looking around. "Now that you mention it, yeah, it's really quiet all of a sudden." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe we'd entered an area with different vegetation that didn't attract as many birds. Or perhaps it was just that time of day when wildlife activity naturally decreased. But I couldn't shake this growing sense of unease, like we were being watched. Casey must have felt it too, because she started walking closer to me, her earlier animated chatter replaced by shorter, more subdued responses. The trail began to climb more steeply here, and the vegetation changed subtly. The familiar maples and oaks gave way to darker, more twisted forms. The undergrowth became denser, with thorny vines that seemed to reach out toward the path. I checked my watch. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours, and according to my calculations, we should be nearing the junction where the spur trail led to the overlook. But something about the trail ahead looked wrong. The path seemed to narrow, and the markers that had been so clear earlier were now faded and sporadic. That's when I felt it. A sudden wave of paranoia so intense it nearly stopped me in my tracks. The whisper of leaves in the wind started to sound like distant voices, and the shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move even when there was no breeze. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I've always been the rational one, the planner, the one who looks for logical explanations. But in that moment, all my certainties began to crumble. The change in Casey happened so suddenly that at first I thought she must have tripped or hurt herself. We had just passed a peculiar formation of rocks, 3 boulders arranged in an almost perfect triangle, when she stopped dead in her tracks. Her body went rigid, and when I turned to ask what was wrong, the look in her eyes made my blood run cold. They weren't her eyes anymore. I know how that sounds, but it's the only way I can describe it. The warm brown eyes I knew so well had become somehow darker, deeper, like wells that went down forever. Her face had drained of color and her hands were trembling at her sides. "Casey?" I reached for her, but she jerked away from my touch. That's when she started screaming. It wasn't a scream of fear or pain. It was something else entirely, something primal and wrong. The sound echoed through the trees, sending a flock of crows bursting into the air from a nearby branch. Her body began to convulse, and her movements became increasingly erratic. I tried to approach her again, to calm her down, to understand what was happening. That's when she lashed out, her hand connecting with my temple and sending my glasses flying. The world immediately blurred into indistinct shapes and colors, and panic seized me as I dropped to my knees, desperately feeling through the leaves and dirt for my glasses. Behind me, I could hear Casey's footsteps as she ran deeper into the forest, her screams growing fainter but no less disturbing. My fingers finally closed around the familiar frame of my glasses, and I jammed them back onto my face, ignoring the smudges and dirt on the lenses. I crashed through the undergrowth after Casey, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The trail was long forgotten now. We were in the true wilderness, where the trees grew closer together and the ground was treacherous with hidden roots and sudden drops. The forest around us had changed completely. The spring woods we'd entered that morning might as well have been in another world. Here the trees were ancient and grotesque, their bark black with rot in places, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The air had become thick with an odd, sweet-sour smell that reminded me of decay. As I ran, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to flit between the trees, always just out of clear sight. The whispers I'd heard earlier grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out any words. Part of my mind tried to rationalize what was happening: panic attack, toxic plants, bad mushrooms. But deep down, I knew we'd stumbled into something else entirely. I caught up to Casey in a small clearing I wish I could forget. The ground was bare earth, perfectly circular, with no vegetation growing within its boundaries. Casey stood in the center, her back to me, completely still. The screaming had stopped. "Casey!" My voice sounded wrong, muffled, as if the air itself was thicker here. She turned slowly, and for a moment I saw something else overlaid on her features, something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. Then she collapsed. I ran to Casey's side, but before I could reach her, something moved at the edge of the clearing. What stepped out of the shadows defied everything I thought I knew about reality. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body emaciated yet powerful, with limbs that seemed too long and jointed in the wrong places. Its skin was a sickly grayish white, stretched tight over protruding bones and riddled with what looked like black veins. But it was the face that haunted my nightmares for years after. A twisted deer skull, yet somehow alive, with empty eye sockets that contained pinpoints of cold blue light. Antlers sprouted from its head, but they were wrong, blackened and twisted, more like dead branches than any natural growth. The thing moved with a terrible grace, stepping into the clearing on legs that bent backward like a deer's butt, ended in long human-like fingers instead of hooves. The air temperature plummeted, and my breath came out in white clouds despite the spring warmth. I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that should not exist, something that predated civilization, that lurked in humanity's oldest nightmares. In that moment, every story Casey had ever told me about Wendigos and skinwalkers crashed into my rational worldview with the force of a freight train. The creature's head tilted to one side, regarding us with those points of cold light. Then it opened its jaw far wider than any deer skull should be able to, and let out a sound that was part scream, part laugh, and part howling wind. I did the only thing I could. I grabbed Casey's unconscious form and ran. What followed was a nightmare marathon through the darkening forest. Casey was surprisingly light in my arms, her body cold and limp. Behind us I could hear the creature moving, not running but keeping pace with an awful steady purpose, its footsteps making no sound on the forest floor. I ran without direction, without thought. driven purely by terror and the desperate need to get Casey to safety. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I barely felt them. The forest seemed to be actively working against us. Trees appeared where none had been before. Roots rose up to trip me. Vines reached for my ankles. The thing behind us never rushed, never seemed to hurry. Yet somehow it was always there, just at the edge of my vision, those blue lights watching, waiting. Sometimes it would make that horrible sound again, and each time it did, Casey's body would twitch and shudder in my arms. I don't know how long I ran, or how I finally found my way back to the trail. Reality seemed to shift and blur around us. One moment we were in that twisted ancient forest, and the next we burst out onto the familiar path, the late afternoon sun suddenly warm on our faces. Casey began to stir as soon as we reached the trail, her eyes fluttering open. She looked confused, disoriented, but herself again. I didn't stop running until we reached the car, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that skull face emerging from the trees. But nothing followed us into the parking lot. The pickup truck was gone, and we were alone. The immediate aftermath was hard to handle. Casey had no memory of what happened after we passed the 3 stones, but she was left with deep scratches on her arms that neither of us could explain. I had my own marks, bruises, cuts, and a persistent tremble in my hands that took weeks to fade. The nightmares started that night. In them, I'm always back in that clearing, watching that thing emerge from the shadows. Sometimes I'm alone, sometimes Casey is there, but they always end the same way, with those blue lights getting closer and closer until I wake up screaming. Casey and I tried to talk about it, but we had different ways of processing what happened. She threw herself into research about folklore and supernatural entities, particularly Native American legends about wendigos and European tales of forest spirits. I tried to find rational explanations, researching local flora that could cause hallucinations, looking into gas pockets or geological phenomena that might explain what we experienced. Our relationship changed after that day. How could it not? We stopped hiking altogether at first. Later we tried some easy trails in well-populated areas, but it wasn't the same. That easy connection we'd had, that shared joy in nature's solitude. It was gone, replaced by a constant undercurrent of fear. We broke up 6 months later. The official reason was that we'd grown apart, but we both knew the truth. That day in the woods had shown us something we couldn't unsee, and we couldn't bear to look at it together anymore. In the years since, I've noticed things, small things that others might dismiss, but that make my blood run cold. Sometimes, on cold nights, I catch a glimpse of blue lights through the trees behind my house. My houseplants die for no apparent reason, their leaves blackened as if touched by frost. I've woken up to find deer skulls arranged in perfect triangles in my backyard, only to have them disappear when I try to photograph them. I've also found others who've had similar experiences in those woods. Not many will talk about it openly, but in certain online forums, in hushed conversations at local bars, I've heard stories that mirror our experience. Always the same elements: the sudden silence, the feeling of being watched, the inexplicable behavior of their companions. The most disturbing discovery came 3 years after our encounter. I was researching local history for work and found photographs from the 1800s of the area where we'd hiked. In one faded image, barely visible in the background, stood 3 stones arranged in a triangle. The caption noted that the local tribes had considered the area cursed and warned settlers to stay away. 8 years have passed, and I still don't know what to believe. The rational part of my 8 years have passed, and I still don't know what to believe. The rational part of my mind keeps searching for logical explanations: toxic plants, shared hallucinations, panic attacks triggered by environmental factors. But late at night, when I hear the wind in the trees outside my window, I know the truth. Something ancient and terrible lives in those woods, something that defies our modern attempts to categorize and explain it. I've changed in ways I never expected. The outdoorsman who once found peace in nature's solitude now triple checks locks and keeps motion sensor lights around his house. I still hike occasionally, but never alone, never in unfamiliar areas, and never in those woods. I've become something of an amateur historian, documenting similar incidents and collecting local legends, though I'm careful about what I share publicly. Casey and I reconnected briefly last year, just coffee, nothing more. She's married now, living in Arizona where the forests are sparse and the trails are wide open to the sky. She told me she still dreams about that day sometimes, though she remembers it differently than I do. In her version, there was singing in the woods, beautiful but terrible, and she wanted to follow it. She's convinced that whatever saved her was my voice, calling her back. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, the constant questioning of what I saw and experienced that day. But I've also learned something else. There are places in this world where the boundary between what we think we know and what actually exists grows thin. Places where ancient things still dwell, watching and waiting. Sometimes I catch myself looking at maps, at the vast green spaces between cities and towns, and wondering how many other places like this exist. How many other hikers have strayed into spaces they shouldn't, seen things they couldn't explain? How many never made it back to tell their stories? I don't expect anyone to believe this account. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived it. But if you're reading this, and if you ever feel that sudden silence fall in the woods, if you ever notice those whispers that sound almost like words, or catch a glimpse of blue lights between the trees, run. Run as fast as you can back to the sunlit world of parking lots and trail maps and rational explanations. Because sometimes, the old warnings are there for a reason. Sometimes, the places our ancestors marked as forbidden still deserve that label. And sometimes, the thing watching you from the shadows is exactly what you fear it to be. Our journey began on a warm July morning. My partner and I, seasoned hikers with a deep love for the outdoors, set out for our favorite camping spot just west of Shenandoah. The location was a hidden gem, offering breathtaking views of both Shenandoah and parts of George Washington National Forest. We cherished the solitude and natural beauty of this off-the-beaten-path site. As we drove along winding roads, the lush greenery of the Appalachian forest surrounded us. The air grew thicker with humidity as we ascended, a common occurrence in these parts during summer. We arrived at our campsite in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the dense canopy above. We efficiently set up our tent, a routine we had perfected over years of camping together. The familiarity of the process was comforting, contrasting with the slight unease that always accompanied being in the wilderness. As night fell, we prepared a simple meal over our portable stove, the aroma of our food mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. That first night we sat outside our tent, marveling at the star-studded sky visible through gaps in the tree cover. The chorus of nocturnal creatures, crickets, owls, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush, provided a soothing backdrop to our quiet conversation. We discussed our plans for the following day, excited about exploring a new area of Jefferson Forest. Despite the peaceful setting, sleep didn't come easily. The humidity clung to our skin, making us toss and turn throughout the night. When dawn broke, we were already awake, eager to start our day's adventure. We packed our day packs with water, snacks, and emergency supplies, a habit ingrained in us through years of hiking experience. The drive to our chosen hiking spot took about 45 minutes, mostly on narrow, winding back roads. As we navigated these less traveled paths, we couldn't help but feel a growing sense of isolation. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, the trees creating a natural tunnel that our vehicle threaded through. Upon arriving at the campsite area where the trailhead was located, we were struck by its emptiness. We had heard that this spot was usually bustling with activity, especially on summer weekends. The quiet was unexpected and somewhat unsettling. As we surveyed the area, we noticed only 2 occupied campsites. The first contained an abandoned tent, weathered and surrounded by scattered debris. It appeared as though someone had been living there for an extended period, but had abruptly left. The sight was disconcerting, raising questions about what might have caused such a hasty departure. At the second occupied site, we encountered a young woman, likely in her late teens. She was in the process of setting up a small backpacking tent, her movements suggesting she was experienced in outdoor activities. 2 vehicles were parked nearby, a truck and a smaller car. As we began unloading our gear, the young woman approached us. Her face showed a mix of friendliness and slight apprehension, which wasn't uncommon when meeting strangers in such an isolated location. She inquired about the trailhead's location, her voice carrying a hint of nervousness that seemed out of place given her apparent outdoor experience. I shared what little information we had, explaining that the trail supposedly branched off from one of the ATV tracks about 100 yards in. Our knowledge was based on online research, and I admitted we weren't entirely certain. Part of me hoped she might join us in our search for the trail, finding safety in numbers. However, after thanking us, she set off alone in the general direction I had indicated. As we watched her disappear into the tree line, an inexplicable sense of unease settled over us. The empty campground, the abandoned tent, and now this solitary young woman venturing into the unknown. It all felt like the beginning of something ominous. Pushing aside our concerns, we gathered our gear and set out to find the trail. The ATV tracks were wide and clearly marked, but identifying the smaller hiking path proved challenging. We spent nearly half an hour exploring different offshoots before finally discovering what appeared to be the correct trail. During our search, we encountered a brief moment of human presence as 2 ATVs roared past us, their engines shattering the forest silence. The riders, faces obscured by helmets, didn't slow or acknowledge us as they sped by. Their passing left us feeling even more isolated in the vast wilderness. As we began our ascent towards the fire tower, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trail was narrow and less maintained than we had anticipated. Roots and rocks created natural obstacles, requiring our full attention to navigate safely. The dense canopy above filtered the sunlight, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor that seemed to shift and move as we walked. The hike was more strenuous than we had expected. The trail inclined steeply at times, forcing us to pause frequently to catch our breath and hydrate. During these breaks, we found ourselves scanning the surrounding forest, half expecting to see the young woman from the campsite. But we encountered no one else on the trail. After about an hour of hiking, we finally reached the summit where the fire tower stood. The structure was older than I had imagined, its metal framework showing signs of wear from years of exposure to the elements. A narrow staircase spiraled up to the observation deck, each step creaking under our weight as we ascended. The view from the top of the tower was underwhelming. While we could see for miles in every direction, the landscape was a monotonous sea of green treetops. The grand vistas we had hoped for were obscured by the dense forest. We took a few obligatory photos, trying to capture some sense of the height and expanse, but ultimately felt a twinge of disappointment. As we began our descent from the tower, an inexplicable change came over the forest. The vibrant ecosystem that had surrounded us on our climb suddenly fell silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, turning off all ambient noise. The absence of bird calls, insect buzzing, and the rustle of leaves in the wind was profound and deeply unsettling. In that moment of unnatural quiet, the forest took on a different character. The trees, which had seemed welcoming and familiar on our ascent, now loomed ominously, Their ancient presence felt oppressive, as if the weight of centuries was bearing down upon us. A sense of claustrophobia set in, despite being in the open air. It was as though the very essence of the forest had shifted, becoming something alien and threatening. Without exchanging words, my partner and I locked eyes, a silent agreement passing between us. We needed to leave, and quickly. Our descent became a hurried scramble down the trail, our earlier caution abandoned in favor of speed. The feeling of being watched, of being pursued by something unseen, grew with each step. As we rounded a sharp bend in the trail, the forest's silence was shattered by an otherworldly shriek. The sound defied description, a horrifying blend of grinding metal and discordant human voices. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with its terrible resonance. In that moment of terror, I caught a glimpse of something. It was there and not there, a presence that seemed to occupy space without having a definite form. It moved in ways that defied physics, flowing like smoke yet sharp as shattered glass. The entity, if it could be called that, had no color that I could discern. Instead, it seemed to be a void, a moving absence of light and matter that radiated malevolence. My perception of this impossible being lasted only a fraction of a second before my mind simply shut down. It was as if my consciousness, unable to process what it had witnessed, chose to protect itself by going blank. The next thing I remember is sitting in our car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. My partner sat beside me, equally dazed and disoriented. A quick glance at the clock revealed that 2 hours had passed since we began our descent from the fire tower, double the time it had taken us to reach the summit. Those missing hours remain a complete blank in both our memories. We've discussed it countless times since, trying to piece together what might have happened, but neither of us can recall a single moment between seeing that entity and finding ourselves back at the car. The campsite appeared unchanged from when we had left it earlier that day. The 2 vehicles we had noticed before were still parked nearby, and the 2 tents remained in their spots. The young woman's tent stood exactly as it had been, with no sign of her return or presence. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively searching for any news of missing hikers in the area. I scoured local newspapers, online forums, and even reached out to park rangers, all while trying to maintain a facade of casual interest. But I found no reports that matched our experience or the young woman we had encountered. The impact of that day lingered long after we returned home. For months, my partner and I avoided discussing what had happened. It was as if speaking about it might somehow make it more real, more tangible. When we finally broached the subject, we found both comfort and concern in the fact that our experiences aligned so closely. Whatever had happened, we had experienced it together. Our love for hiking and the outdoors remained, but it was now tinged with a wariness we had never known before. We continued to plan trips and explore new trails, but we found ourselves unconsciously avoiding the Appalachian forest. The mere thought of returning to that region filled us with an inexplicable dread. As time passed, I began to seek out others who might have had similar experiences. I scoured online forums and message boards, reading countless stories of strange occurrences in the wilderness. While many of these tales were clearly embellished or outright fabrications, a few resonated with the terror and confusion we had felt that day. These accounts, while unsettling, provided a strange sort of comfort. They suggested that we weren't alone in our experience, that others had encountered things in the depths of the forest that defied explanation. Yet they also deepened the mystery, raising more questions than answers. To this day, I find myself returning to the memory of that young woman at the campsite. Did she encounter the same phenomenon we did? Did she make it out of the forest safely? Or is she somehow still there, lost in those missing hours that my mind refuses to recall? The experience has left an indelible mark on us. While we still find joy and solace in nature, There's always a part of us that remains vigilant, aware that the wilderness holds secrets and dangers beyond our understanding. The Appalachian Forest, once a place of beauty and adventure, now represents a boundary in our minds, a line we're not yet ready to cross again. As I share this story, I can't help but wonder how many others have had encounters like ours. How many hikers, campers, and outdoor enthusiasts have brushed against the inexplicable in the depths of the forest? And how many have chosen to remain silent, fearing that their experiences would be met with disbelief or ridicule? The open road stretched before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast American landscape. My loyal companion, a scruffy mutt with soulful eyes, sat contentedly in the passenger seat, his head hanging out the window as we cruised along. We were on a cross-country adventure, just the two of us, with Yellowstone National Park as our next destination. As we approached the park, my excitement grew. I had heard so much about its natural wonders, the geysers, hot springs, and diverse wildlife. The plan was simple: find a campsite, set up for the night, and spend the next few days exploring this magnificent wilderness. The sun was already dipping low on the horizon when we finally reached the park entrance. After paying the entry fee and receiving a map from the ranger, I drove towards the first campground on my list. To my dismay, a large, full sign greeted me at the entrance. No problem, I thought. There are plenty of other campgrounds in the park. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a long and frustrating search. As I drove from one campground to another, the story remained the same. Every single site was occupied. The park was teeming with visitors, all eager to experience the beauty of Yellowstone during the peak season. I circled the park's main loop road multiple times, hoping that someone might have left early or that a last-minute cancellation would open up a spot. With each passing minute, the sun sank lower, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. Under different circumstances, I would have marveled at the breathtaking sunset, but my growing concern about finding a place to sleep overshadowed its beauty. As darkness settled over the park, I realized I had to make a decision. The idea of sleeping in my car in a parking lot didn't appeal to me, especially with my furry friend in tow. That's when I remembered passing a secluded trailhead earlier. It wasn't an official campsite, but it seemed like the best option given the circumstances. With a mix of trepidation and determination, I steered my vehicle back to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, which was both a relief and slightly unnerving. I quickly gathered my gear, strapping my frame pack to my back and ensuring I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few basic tools. My dog seemed to sense the change in plans, wagging his tail excitedly as we set off down the trail. The path was barely visible in the fading light, but I had a good flashlight to guide our way. We hiked for about 15 minutes, moving deeper into the wilderness, before I decided we had gone far enough to avoid detection. Veering off the trail, we made our way to the edge of a small clearing. It was a picturesque spot, with a grassy meadow surrounded by towering pines. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of mountains against the star-studded sky. Despite the unplanned nature of our campsite, I couldn't help but feel a sense of adventure and connection with nature. Knowing the importance of minimizing our impact on the environment, I carefully selected a spot for our camp. I chose a flat area with minimal vegetation, hoping to leave as little trace as possible of our presence. My first task was to dig a small fire pit. Using a collapsible shovel from my pack, I scraped away the top layer of soil and created a circular depression. Next came the tent. I had practiced setting it up in my backyard before the trip, and that practice paid off now as I efficiently assembled our shelter for the night. My dog watched curiously, occasionally sniffing around the perimeter of our makeshift campsite. With the tent up, I turned my attention to dinner. I had packed some hot dogs, thinking they'd be an easy meal to cook over a campfire. As I gathered some small branches and kindling for the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruders in this wild place. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me pause and look around, half expecting to see a park ranger or wild animal emerging from the darkness. Once the fire was going, I roasted the hot dogs on long sticks. My canine companion sat patiently, his eyes fixed on the sizzling meat. The aroma of cooking food filled the air, and I hoped it wouldn't attract any unwanted visitors. We shared our simple meal, the hot dogs tasting better than any gourmet dish in that moment of hunger and exhaustion. After dinner, I meticulously cleaned up our site. I knew the importance of proper food storage in bear country, so I gathered all our leftovers and trash into a bag. Using some rope from my pack, I hung the bag high in a nearby tree, well away from our tent. It was a bit of a struggle in the dark, but I knew it was crucial for our safety. With everything secured, I extinguished the fire, making sure to douse it thoroughly with water from my canteen. I scattered the wet ashes and covered the fire pit with the soil I had initially removed, trying to erase any evidence of our presence. Exhausted from the long day of driving and the unexpected hike, I crawled into the tent with my dog. The lightweight sleeping bag provided welcome warmth against the cool night air. As I lay there, listening to the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement at the adventure, a twinge of guilt for camping in an unauthorized area, and a hint of apprehension about what the night might bring. Sleep came quickly, but it was destined to be a night of interruptions. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when the first howl pierced the night. At first, it sounded distant, maybe a few miles away. In my groggy state, I marveled at the haunting beauty of the sound. It was a reminder that we were in true wilderness, sharing the land with its wild inhabitants. As I started to drift back to sleep, another howl rang out, this time noticeably closer. My dog, who had been sleeping soundly at my feet, raised his head, ears perked in alert curiosity. I patted him reassuringly, trying to convey a calmness I didn't entirely feel. The howls continued, each time seeming to come from a different direction and growing ever closer. It was hard to judge distance in the dark, unfamiliar terrain, but I estimated that the wolves were now at the edge of the meadow where we were camped. My mind raced, trying to recall everything I knew about wolf behavior. I knew attacks on humans were extremely rare, but that did little to calm my racing heart. Soon the sounds of padding feet and sniffing noses circled our tent. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. My dog, to his credit, remained silent, though I could feel him trembling slightly against my leg. The wolves seemed curious, investigating this strange new object in their territory. Those minutes felt like hours as we waited, hoping the wolves would lose interest and move on. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the sounds began to recede. A distant howl signaled that the pack was moving away, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. As the adrenaline subsided, exhaustion took over once more, and I drifted back to sleep. The next time I awoke, the sky outside was still dark, but I had the sense that several hours had passed. This time, however, the sounds that roused me were very different. Heavy footfalls circled the tent, accompanied by deep, huffing breaths. My first thought was bear, and a jolt of fear shot through me. While wolves were unlikely to attack, a hungry or curious bear could easily see our tent as something to investigate more thoroughly. The unseen visitor seemed particularly interested in the spot where I had buried the fire pit. I silently cursed myself for not being more thorough in cleaning up. Even the faintest scent of food could attract a bear's keen nose. After nosing around the fire pit area, the bear turned its attention to our tent. Each lumbering step it took sent vibrations through the ground, emphasizing its massive size. As it circled closer, I knew I had to do something to deter it without provoking an attack. With trembling hands, I reached for my flashlight. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I flicked it on, illuminating the tent from within. The sudden appearance of the glowing dome seemed to startle the bear. I heard a surprised huff, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. Even after the sounds of the bear faded away, sleep eluded me. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig brought me to full alert. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, I finally felt it was safe enough to peer outside. Unzipping the tent cautiously, I stuck my head out and surveyed our surroundings. The meadow was peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of our nighttime visitors. A light rain had begun to fall, adding a misty quality to the scene that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Knowing we needed to leave quickly, I began packing up our campsite. The rain made everything damp, adding to the challenge of breaking camp. My dog seemed eager to be on the move, perhaps still unsettled by the night's events. We hiked back to the trailhead in record time, my pace quickened by the desire to return to the relative safety of populated areas. As we drove away from the parking lot, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering excitement from our wilderness encounter. Luck was finally on our side as we found a campground with a vacancy that morning. As I was setting up my damp tent to dry, a park ranger approached, clipboard in hand. He asked about my previous night's accommodation, mentioning they had a record of my entry but no registered campsite. In a moment of panic, I lied, claiming I had slept in my truck in a parking lot. The ranger seemed skeptical but didn't press the issue, simply reminding me of the park's camping regulations and moving on. I felt a twinge of guilt for the deception, but was relieved to avoid any potential fines or reprimands. The rest of our time in Yellowstone was, thankfully, far less eventful. We spent our days exploring the park's famous attractions, watching Old Faithful erupt, marveling at the colorful hot springs, and observing herds of bison from a safe distance. Each night, I made sure we were safely checked into an official campsite well before dark. As our time in the park came to an end, we hit the road again, heading west towards Portland, Oregon. The journey took us through changing landscapes, from the rugged mountains of Idaho to the high desert of eastern Oregon, and finally into the lush greenery of the Pacific Northwest. We took our time, stopping at various campsites along the way. Each night as I set up our tent in designated camping areas, I couldn't help but reflect on our Yellowstone adventure. While it had been frightening at times, it had also given me a profound respect for the wild places and creatures we share this planet with. Arriving in Portland felt like the end of an epic journey. The city's quirky charm and abundant green spaces were a welcoming sight after so many days on the road. We spent a week exploring the city and its surroundings, hiking in the Columbia River Gorge and along the Oregon coast. As I sat in a Portland coffee shop on our last day, planning the next leg of our journey, I couldn't help but smile at the memory of that night in Yellowstone. It had been unplanned, uncomfortable, and at times terrifying, but it was also an experience I would never forget. It had taught me about my own resilience, the unpredictability of nature, and the importance of respecting wildlife and wilderness areas. That night in Yellowstone, while not the comfortable camping experience I had initially planned, had become the defining moment of our cross-country adventure. It was a reminder that sometimes the most memorable experiences come from the unexpected turns in our journey, and that nature, in all its beauty and wildness, deserves our respect and admiration. As we prepared to leave Portland and continue our journey, I felt a renewed sense of excitement for the road ahead. Whatever challenges or adventures awaited us, I knew we were ready to face them. My loyal dog and I, two travelers making our way across this vast and beautiful country. It was a warm summer evening in 2017 when I found myself driving through the winding roads of rural Virginia. My car, a weathered 2003 Toyota Camry that had become my home in recent months, rumbled along the cracked pavement as I searched for a place to rest for the night. The dashboard clock read 7:42 p.m., and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the countryside and painting the sky in rich hues of orange and pink. The air conditioning struggled against the lingering heat, and the radio signal had long since dissolved into static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. The circumstances that had led me to this nomadic existence were complicated. A combination of a career setback, a painful divorce, and a desire to simply drive away from it all. I'd been on the road for 3 months, picking up odd jobs when I needed money, sleeping in campgrounds or rest stops, and trying to piece together what the next chapter of my life might look like. The solitude had become both a comfort and a burden, teaching me things about myself I wasn't sure I wanted to know. As I navigated the unfamiliar terrain, my headlights caught a wooden sign indicating a campground ahead, Pine Grove Recreational Area. The carved letters were weathered but still legible, and an arrow pointed down a narrow gravel road that disappeared into a thick stand of oak and pine trees. Feeling the weight of exhaustion from hours of driving, I decided to pull in and find a spot to settle for the night. The campground was more expansive than I'd expected, with numerous clearings nestled among the trees. To my relief, it appeared mostly empty, save for a large group gathered in a distant corner of the grounds. Their vehicles, mostly pickup trucks and SUVs, parked in a rough semicircle around what appeared to be a communal area. I chose a spot far from the group, hoping for a quiet night's rest. The clearing I selected was bordered by 2 massive oak trees, their branches creating a natural canopy overhead. As I began to set up my modest camp, really just a hammock strung between the trees and a small tarp for protection against unexpected rain, I couldn't help but notice the boisterous sounds emanating from the other campers. Their laughter and chatter carried on the evening breeze, punctuated occasionally by the barking of dogs and the distinctive sound of beer cans being opened. The ritual of setting up camp had become second nature to me over the past months. I unpacked my small cooler with its meager supplies and prepared a simple dinner of canned beans and crackers, supplemented with an apple that was slightly past its prime. As I ate, perched on a fallen log I'd dragged near my hammock, I watched the sky darken and stars begin to twinkle overhead. The air grew cooler, and I pulled on a worn University of Michigan sweatshirt to ward off the chill. The fabric still carried the faint scent of my former life, laundry detergent from a house I no longer lived in, memories of a marriage that had crumbled beneath the weight of unspoken words and growing distance. Throughout the evening, several dogs from the other group wandered over to investigate my campsite. They were an odd mix: a couple of German shepherds, a Rottweiler, and what looked like a pit bull mix. They seemed friendly enough, sniffing around curiously before returning to their owners. I found their presence somewhat comforting, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this unfamiliar place, though something about their well-trained, almost militant behavior struck me as unusual for typical camping dogs. As night fully settled in, I retreated to my hammock, looking forward to a peaceful sleep beneath the canopy of trees. The sounds from the other group had quieted somewhat, though there was an undercurrent of tension in their hushed conversations that carried across the darkness. I lay there, gently swaying in the breeze, listening to the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had begun to settle over me like a heavy blanket. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, a commotion from across the campground jolted me awake. Voices rose in volume, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Car doors slammed and flashlight beams began to dance through the trees. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sat up in my hammock, straining my eyes to see what was happening in the distance. The moon had risen, casting a pale light that created more shadows than illumination. What I witnessed next sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. In the dim light of the camp, I could make out the silhouette of a woman leading a small child. probably no more than 6 or 7 years old, towards a large wooden structure that I hadn't noticed being assembled in the darkness. As they drew closer to the structure, I realized with growing horror that it was a cross, standing at least 15 feet tall against the night sky, its rough-hewn surface pale in the moonlight. My heart began to race as I watched the woman gently guide the child's hand, helping them light what appeared to be a torch. The flames caught quickly, and within moments, the cross was ablaze, casting an eerie glow across the campground and illuminating the faces of those gathered around. It was then that the true nature of this group became horrifyingly clear. What I had mistaken for a family camping gathering was actually a Klan meeting. The burning cross stood as a symbol of hatred and intolerance, a rallying point for the Ku Klux Klan members who had gathered here in secret. As the fire grew, so did the fervor of the group. What had earlier been casual conversations transformed into something far more sinister. Voices rose in a cacophony of hatred, shouting slogans and chants that made my blood run cold. The white robes and hoods that some members now wore seemed to glow in the firelight, creating ghostly silhouettes that would haunt my dreams for years to come. "White power!" they cried, their voices filled with a misguided passion that made me physically recoil in my hammock. The speeches that followed were like something from a historical documentary, but happening here and now, in real time. A tall man in civilian clothes, likely their leader, stepped forward into the firelight. His voice carried across the campground with practiced authority, his words a toxic mixture of conspiracy theories and racial grievances that he delivered with the cadence of a preacher. I found myself holding my breath, torn between the instinct to flee and the paralyzing fear of drawing attention to myself by moving. My car was parked on the other side of the clearing. Getting to it would mean potentially being seen. The ceremonial atmosphere of the gathering suggested this wasn't a spontaneous event, but rather a carefully planned meeting. My mind raced with questions about whether they had lookouts posted, whether they had noticed my arrival earlier, whether my Michigan license plate had already marked me as an outsider. The children present, and there were several, not just the one who had helped light the cross, were dressed in what appeared to be scout-like uniforms. They stood in formation, backs straight, eyes forward, absorbing every word of hatred as if it were Sunday school scripture. One little girl, her blonde hair and pigtails, clutched a doll while her mother adjusted her collar with the same care any parent might show before a school photo. The normalcy of that maternal gesture, set against the backdrop of such hatred, made my stomach turn. A new speaker took the makeshift podium they had erected, this time a woman wearing a business suit rather than robes. Her presence suggested a calculating attempt at legitimacy, as if her professional appearance could somehow sanitize the poison she spewed. She spoke of preserving heritage and protecting our children's future, wrapping virulent racism in the language of family values and tradition. What struck me most was how ordinary these people appeared when they weren't in their robes. They could have been teachers, accountants, your neighbors. The night air had grown thick with wood smoke and tension. More crosses were lit, smaller ones arranged in a pattern around the central blaze. The fires cast jumping shadows through the trees, creating nightmarish shapes that seemed to dance between the trunks. The German shepherds that had seemed so friendly earlier now paced the perimeter of the gathering, their training evident in their alert postures and focused gazes. Hours passed like this, with speakers rotating and rituals being performed that seemed to be a twisted parody of religious ceremonies. They sang hymns, actual Christian hymns, interspersed with what I assumed were songs specific to their organization. The contradiction was jarring. The same melodies that might comfort a congregation on Sunday morning were here being used to celebrate hatred. Around midnight, the ceremony shifted. The children were led away by a few of the women, presumably to sleep in the RVs and tents scattered around the edges of their campsite. The speeches became more specific, more tactical. They discussed recruitment strategies, planned gatherings, and ways to identify potential allies in local government. The business-like tone of these conversations was perhaps more chilling than the earlier displays of overt racism. This wasn't just theater, it was strategic planning. I must have eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, my exhaustion finally overwhelming my fear. My dreams were a confused jumble of burning crosses, children's faces, and dark roads leading nowhere. I woke frequently, each time tensing at the sound of branches cracking under unseen feet or distant conversations I couldn't quite make out. Dawn broke with an almost insulting beauty, painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold. The morning light revealed the remnants of the previous night's activities: charred wood scattered across the clearing, empty beer cans, and tire tracks carved deep into the soft ground. Most of the group appeared to be sleeping, though I could see a few early risers starting campfires for breakfast, going about their morning routines as if they hadn't spent the night participating in a ritual of hatred. I packed up my campsite with trembling hands, trying to be as quiet as possible while moving as quickly as I could. Every sound seemed magnified in the morning stillness: the zip of my bag, the crunch of leaves under my feet, the creak of my car door. The drive out of the campground was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I half expected to be stopped, questioned, or worse, but no one paid any attention to my departure. Once I hit the main road, I drove for hours without stopping, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Pine Grove. The events of the night played on an endless loop in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of that first child lighting the cross, the careful way their small hand had been guided to participate in such a significant act of hate. It was an initiation, I realized, not just into an organization, but into a world view that would shape their entire life. That experience in rural Virginia became a watershed moment in my life. The comfortable fiction that racism was a relic of the past, something confined to history books and grainy photographs, had been shattered. I had witnessed its modern face, not just angry people shouting slurs, but organized, educated individuals methodically passing their hatred down to a new generation. In the years that followed, I found my way back to a more settled life. The divorce that had sent me on my cross-country journey eventually became just another chapter in my past. I found a new job, bought a small house, started rebuilding, but I never forgot that night at Pine Grove. The memory of it drove me to become more involved in civil rights organizations, to speak up against casual racism when I encountered it, to donate to educational programs promoting diversity and inclusion. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about those children. They'd be teenagers now, or close to it. I wonder if any of them managed to break free from the ideology they were born into, if they found their way to a broader view of humanity. I wonder if that little girl with the doll still has her childhood innocence, or if it's been fully replaced by the hatred she was taught to embrace. What I witnessed that night was more than just a racist gathering. It was a glimpse into the machinery of how hatred perpetuates itself, how it's carefully packaged and passed down through generations. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the burning crosses or the chants. It was the mundane, almost bureaucratic nature of how they organized their bigotry, how they normalized it for their children, how they wrapped it in the familiar trappings of community and tradition. This story doesn't have a dramatic ending. No confrontations, no heroic stands against evil. Just a quiet witness to darkness, and the lingering responsibility that comes with such knowledge. In sharing this experience, I hope to shed light on the ongoing presence of organized hatred in our midst, and the urgent need to remain vigilant against its spread. The battle against racism isn't fought only in grand gestures and public protests. It's fought in small moments of courage, in speaking up, in teaching children a better way. The road out of Pine Grove led me not just away from that place, but toward a deeper understanding of my own role in the world. We can't change what we refuse to acknowledge, and having seen what I saw, silence was no longer an option. The weight of that night stays with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the work still to be done, the conversations still to be had, and the hope that future generations might know a world where such gatherings are truly just artifacts of a distant past. The cold metal of my rifle pressed against my back as I made my way through the dense undergrowth of the Olympic National Forest. The canopy above was so thick that only slivers of moonlight pierced through, casting eerie shadows that danced across the forest floor. My name is Reuben Dyer, and for the past 6 years I've been part of a covert government unit that deals with creatures most people believe exist only in nightmares and folklore. Before joining this unit, I'd spent a decade in military special operations, followed by a stint in high-risk private security. I thought I'd seen it all, faced every kind of danger a man could face. But nothing, not the scorching deserts of the Middle East, not the treacherous mountain passes of Afghanistan, not even the cutthroat world of corporate espionage had prepared me for the horrors I've witnessed in this job. Our unit operates under the radar, and for good reason. The things we hunt aren't the kind you talk about over dinner. They're the monsters that lurk in the shadows, the creatures that go bump in the night. And trust me, they're far more terrifying than anything your imagination can conjure. This latest assignment had brought us to the backwoods of Washington State. For months, rumors had been circulating about a series of brutal killings. Officially, it was written off as animal attacks, maybe a rogue bear or a particularly aggressive mountain lion. But the authorities knew better. That's where we came in. As I pushed through a particularly thick patch of ferns, I caught sight of Hank, our team's grizzled veteran. He was crouched low, examining something on the forest floor. Hank had been doing this job longer than anyone else on the team. Hell, longer than most people in our entire organization. He didn't say much, but when he did, you listened. "What have you got, Hank?" I whispered, careful not to disturb the unnatural quiet of the forest. Hank looked up at me, his weathered face creased with concern. "Tracks," he muttered, gesturing to the ground. "Like nothing I've ever seen before." I knelt beside him, my eyes struggling to make out what he was seeing in the dim light. Then I saw it, a massive footprint, easily twice the size of a human's, with long, curved claw marks etched deep into the soft earth. "Jesus," I breathed, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the warm night air. Hank nodded grimly. "Whatever made this, it's big, and it's close." As if on cue, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind us. We both whirled around, weapons at the ready, but there was nothing there, just more trees and shadows. "We should regroup with the others," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Hank nodded in agreement, and we began making our way back to where we'd left the rest of our team. Our group for this mission was a mix of veterans and rookies. Besides Hank and myself, there was Jess, a former FBI profiler with a knack for tracking that bordered on supernatural. Then there were the new guys, Gabe and Wyatt, fresh out of whatever shadowy training program our organization ran. They were green, jumping at every snap of a twig, but they had potential. We found them gathered around a small clearing, tension evident in their postures. Jess was poring over a map spread out on a fallen log, while Gabe and Wyatt kept watch, their eyes darting nervously between the trees. "Find anything?" Jess asked as we approached, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, gesturing for everyone to gather closer. "Tracks," I said. "Big ones. Whatever we're dealing with, it's not your average predator." Jess's eyes narrowed. "I've been going over the reports of the attacks, the victims. They weren't just killed. They were torn apart, like something was feeding on them." I saw Gabe blanch at her words, and even Wyatt looked a little green around the gills. I couldn't blame them. This job had a way of showing you the darkest aspects of nature, and sometimes things that defied nature altogether. "All right, listen up," I said, taking charge of the situation. "We're going to set up base at the old ranger station about a mile north of here. It's defensible, and it'll give us a good vantage point to plan our next move. We move in pairs, eyes and ears open. Whatever's out there, it knows these woods better than we do. Stay alert." As we gathered our gear and prepared to move out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around us seemed to press in, the darkness between the trees hiding untold dangers. I'd been on countless missions like this before, but something about this one felt different. There was a weight to the air, a sense of ancient, primal fear that set my teeth on edge. Little did I know, as we set off towards the ranger station, that we were walking into a nightmare beyond anything we could have imagined. The hunt had begun, but we were no longer the hunters. We were the prey. The old ranger station loomed before us, a dilapidated wooden structure that seemed to sag under the weight of the surrounding forest. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the maw of some ancient, slumbering beast. "All right, let's secure the perimeter," I ordered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jess, you're with me. We'll take the inside. Hank, you and the rookies check the grounds." The floorboards creaked ominously as Jess and I entered the station, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beams, and the musty smell of abandonment filled our nostrils. "This place has seen better days," Jess muttered, her eyes scanning the room. I nodded, moving towards a cluttered desk in the corner. "Let's see if we can find anything useful." As we rummaged through old logbooks and weather reports, a chill ran down my spine. Something about this place felt wrong, like we were disturbing something that should have been left alone. Suddenly, Jess froze. "Reuben," she whispered, "look at this." She was holding a yellowed newspaper clipping dated nearly 50 years ago. The headline read, "Missing hiker's case remains unsolved." It's been happening for decades, I realized, a knot forming in my stomach. Before we could discuss it further, Hank's gruff voice crackled over our radios. "You two better get out here. We found something." We rushed outside to find Hank and the rookies gathered around a large tree at the edge of the clearing. As we got closer, I saw what had caught their attention. Deep, jagged claw marks scored into the bark, easily 8 feet off the ground. "Jesus," Gabe breathed, his face pale in the moonlight. "Whatever made these," Hank said grimly, "it's big, and it's marking its territory." A heavy silence fell over the group as the reality of our situation sank in. We were dealing with something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. "We need to set up surveillance," I decided. "Cameras, motion sensors, the works. If this thing comes back, we need to be ready." The next few hours were a flurry of activity as we fortified our position. By the time dawn broke, the ranger station had been transformed into a high-tech command center. Screens flickered with live feeds from cameras hidden throughout the surrounding forest, and a web of sensors created an invisible perimeter around our base. As the others caught some much-needed rest, I sat at the main console, my eyes glued to the monitors. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, but I knew better. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Days passed with no sign of our quarry. The tension was palpable, fraying nerves and shortening tempers. Gabe and Wyatt spent their time cleaning their weapons obsessively, while Hank pored over topographical maps, searching for any clue that might lead us to our prey. It was on the 4th day that things began to unravel. Jess had picked up a trail, something faint but promising. We found ourselves at the edge of a steep ravine, the ground soft and muddy beneath our feet. "The tracks are deep," Jess murmured, crouched over a series of impressions in the earth. "Whatever it is, it's massive." But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The tracks ended abruptly at the edge of the ravine, as if the creature had simply vanished into thin air. "It's messing with us," Hank growled, his eyes scanning the tree line. We spread out, moving cautiously through the undergrowth. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects conspicuously absent. I kept my rifle close, finger resting lightly on the trigger. That's when we heard it, a blood-curdling scream that shattered the silence like a gunshot. We spun around to see Gabe crumpled on the ground, blood pouring from a gash in his throat. Wyatt stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror, as something massive and dark darted through the underbrush. I fired instinctively, the rapport of my rifle echoing through the trees, but the creature was gone, vanishing into the dense foliage as quickly as it had appeared. Hank was at Gabe's side in an instant, trying desperately to staunch the bleeding, but it was too late. The young agent's eyes stared sightlessly at the canopy above, his face frozen in a mask of terror. "What the hell was that?" Jess hissed, her voice trembling. "It's playing with us," Hank said grimly, wiping blood from his hands. "That thing is smarter than we gave it credit for." We retreated to the ranger station, our spirits broken and our nerves shattered. As we barricaded the doors and windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer the hunters. We had become the hunted. Night fell, bringing with it a suffocating darkness that seemed to press in on us from all sides. The ranger station, once our refuge, now felt like a cage. It started with a low, vibrating hum that resonated through the walls, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, deep and primal, making my teeth ache and my heart race. "It's here," Hank whispered, his face ashen in the dim light of our monitors. The attack came swiftly and without mercy. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and there it was, a nightmare made flesh. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a patchwork of different animals. Thick, sinewy limbs covered in coarse black fur ended in razor-sharp claws. Its maw was lined with jagged teeth, like rows of serrated knives. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me to my core, glowing orbs that radiated a malevolent intelligence. It lunged at Hank first, moving with a speed that defied its size. He fired point blank, the bullets tearing into its flesh, but it barely slowed. With one swipe of its massive paw, it sent Hank crashing into the wall, leaving a smear of blood in his wake. Jess was next, emptying her clip into the beast's side. For a moment I dared to hope it might be enough. But then it turned on her, jaws snapping shut around her arm with a sickening crunch. Her scream of agony was cut short as it tore into her, ripping flesh from bone with savage efficiency. I grabbed the shotgun, our last line of defense, and fired. The blast caught the creature in the head, staggering it momentarily. But it wasn't enough. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the station, it charged at me. I fired again, aiming for its chest. The creature swayed, its glowing eyes rolling back in its head, before it finally crumpled to the ground. For a long moment I stood there, shotgun trained on its still form, hardly daring to breathe. When I was finally certain it wasn't getting back up, I turned to my fallen comrades. Jess was barely clinging to life, blood pooling around her mangled body. Hank was slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged and labored. Wyatt was nowhere to be seen, likely taken during our retreat to the station. With shaking hands, I radioed for extraction, my voice cracking as I relayed our coordinates. It felt like an eternity before I heard the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. As the medical team rushed Jess and Hank to safety, I stayed behind, watching as another team carefully loaded the creature's body into a containment unit. Unlike other cryptids we'd encountered, this one didn't fade away or dissolve into nothingness. It remained solid, real, undeniable proof of the nightmare we'd endured. Months have passed since that fateful night in the Olympic National Forest. Jess and Hank survived, barely, but they'll never be the same. The physical scars will heal, but the memories, those will haunt us forever. The creature, whatever it was, is now locked away in some top-secret facility, being studied by scientists who probably don't fully grasp the danger they're dealing with. Part of me hopes they'll find a way to prevent something like this from happening again. Another part dreads what other horrors their research might uncover. As for me, I'm still with the unit. Someone has to do this job, to stand between the darkness and the unsuspecting world. But now, every time I step into a forest or hear an unexplained noise in the night, I can't help but wonder, what else is out there, waiting to be found? The real horror isn't the creatures we hunt. It's the knowledge that there are more out there, hidden in the shadows of our world. And someday we might meet something we can't stop. But that's a problem for another day. For now, I'll keep doing what I do best, hunting the things that hunt us. Because in this line of work, you never know which mission might be your last. They say that children are more attuned to the supernatural realm, their minds more open to the whispers from beyond the veil that separates our world from the unknown. I'm not sure if I truly believe that, but I can't deny the experiences that shaped my childhood. Experiences that have left an indelible mark on my psyche, even as an adult. As a child, I was plagued by recurring nightmares, each more vivid and terrifying than the last. These weren't your typical childhood fears of monsters under the bed or shadows in the closet. No, these dreams were something else entirely, something that felt far too real to be dismissed as mere flights of fancy. In these bizarre nocturnal visions, I would often find myself in familiar settings, my home, my neighborhood, but twisted into nightmarish versions of themselves. The most unsettling element, however, was always the same. A demonic presence that would speak to me through various manifestations. Sometimes it was through flames that danced in our attic, casting writhing shadows on the walls. Other times, it emerged from the depths of an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The voice was always the same, evil, malicious, dripping with a hatred that seemed to transcend human understanding. It would threaten me, my family, or sometimes speak in languages I couldn't comprehend, the guttural sounds filling me with an inexplicable dread. But there's one nightmare in particular that has stayed with me throughout my entire life, its details etched into my memory with painful clarity. Even now, years later, I can recall every moment as if it happened yesterday. The dream began on a night much like any other in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I found myself outside my house, which was unusual in itself. You see, in our household, we lived by a strict rule. When the streetlights come on, it's time to come in, or you will be grounded. This rule was as immutable as the laws of physics, so my presence outside after dark immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying with it the faint scent of cut grass and the distant hum of crickets. But there was something else, too, an underlying wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The shadows seemed deeper, the darkness between the streetlights more absolute than it should have been. I turned to look at my house, drawn by the warm glow emanating from the windows. Through the glass, I could see into our dining room, where my family was gathered around the table for dinner. The scene was so normal, so ordinary, that it made the wrongness of my situation even more apparent. My parents sat at either end of the table, my siblings in their usual places. I could see their mouths moving as they talked and laughed, passing dishes back and forth. But there was no sound. It was like watching a silent movie, a perfect facsimile of family life but devoid of all audio. What struck me most, however, was their complete lack of concern for my absence. There was no empty chair at the table, no worried glances at the door. It was as if I didn't exist at all. Panic began to well up inside me. I ran to the window, pressing my hands against the cool glass. I banged on it, shouting at the top of my lungs, trying desperately to get their attention. But it was no use. They couldn't hear me. They couldn't see me. I was a ghost in my own home. Desperation mounting, I turned away from the window, my eyes scanning the familiar landscape of our street. That's when I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a swing set in our driveway. It was an old-fashioned metal frame with two swings, the kind you might see in a park from decades past. And on one of the swings sat my best friend, Kyle. Relief washed over me at the sight of him. Kyle lived just a house or two away from mine, and his presence was a comforting reminder of normalcy in this increasingly bizarre situation. But as I approached him, that sense of wrongness returned, stronger than ever. Kyle was swinging gently back and forth, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't seem to notice my approach, didn't respond when I called his name. When I reached the swing set and sat down beside him, he continued his rhythmic motion as if I wasn't there at all. "Kyle?" I said, my voice sounding small and frightened even to my own ears. "Kyle, can you hear me?" No response, just the creaking of the swing chains and the soft scuff of his shoes on the ground. I reached out to touch his arm, but my hand passed right through him, as if he were made of smoke. A chill ran down my spine and I jerked my hand back, staring at it in disbelief. That's when I remembered the candy I had stashed in my backyard. In the twisted logic of dreams, I became convinced that if I could just get Kyle to eat some of the candy, he would snap out of whatever trance he was in. He would see me, talk to me, and everything would be okay. "Kyle, wait here, okay?" I said, even though he hadn't acknowledged me once. "I have a surprise for us. Just don't go anywhere. Please." I ran to the spot where I really did have Starburst hidden from my parents, behind a loose brick in the garden wall. My hands shook as I retrieved the slightly squashed packet, the familiar wrappers a splash of color in the monotone nightmare world. Clutching the candy like a lifeline, I sprinted back to the front of the house, hope blooming in my chest. But as I rounded the corner, that hope withered and died. The swing set was empty, one seat still swaying gently back and forth as if its occupant had just left. Kyle was gone. I stood there, frozen, the candy falling from my nerveless fingers. The wrongness that had been lurking at the edges of my perception now crashed over me like a wave. The houses up and down the street, which had been lit and alive just moments ago, were now dark and shuttered. It was as if everyone in the world had disappeared, leaving me alone in this silent, empty facsimile of my neighborhood. That's when I noticed the streetlights. One by one, starting from the far end of the street, they began to go out. It wasn't a gentle fading, but a sudden, violent extinguishing, as if something was devouring the light itself. And in the wake of each darkened lamppost, I could see it. That familiar darkness that I knew all too well from my other nightmares. It was deeper than the absence of light, a writhing, malevolent blackness that seemed to pulse with evil intent. And it was coming for me. Panic exploded in my chest. I ran back to my house, my safe haven, the one place where I should have been protected. I pounded on the door, rang the doorbell over and over, screaming for my parents, my siblings, anyone to let me in. But the house remained silent and dark. Through the window, I could see that the dining room was now empty, the chairs pushed neatly under the table, as if the family dinner I had witnessed earlier had never happened at all. I turned back to the street, watching in horror as the darkness crept closer, extinguishing light after light. I could feel its hunger, its eagerness to finally claim me after all these years of tormenting my dreams. As the last street light flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness, I heard it, that familiar demonic laughter that had haunted so many of my nightmares. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air around me, vibrating through my very bones. I squeezed my eyes shut, knowing that this was it. This would be the time it finally consumed me. I felt tricked, betrayed by my own mind, and utterly terrified. There was nothing I could do as the darkness closed in, its icy tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me into its embrace. The last thing I remember is the sound of that laughter growing louder, drowning out my screams, as the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echo of that laughter still ringing in my ears. It took me several long moments to realize I was safe in my bed, that it had all been a dream, but had it? That was the last time I ever had a nightmare of that intensity. It was as if something had changed that night, as if the darkness had finally found what it was looking for and no longer needed to torment my sleeping mind. But sometimes I wonder if it really did find its way in that day. Ever since then, I've been drawn to dark things in a way I can't explain. Occasionally I'm blindsided by bouts of debilitating depression that seem to come out of nowhere, plunging me into a darkness that feels all too familiar. I know this was a dream, a product of my sleeping mind, but that doesn't make it any less real or true. The fear I felt, the hopelessness, the sense of being utterly alone in a world gone wrong, these were all real. And sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, when the shadows seem to move of their own accord and the silence feels heavy with unseen presence, I find myself wondering, did I ever really wake up? The last day of ninth grade had finally arrived, and the air was electric with the promise of summer freedom. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of our freshman year, my girlfriend Brooklyn and I exchanged excited glances. We had been planning this trip for weeks, a camping excursion to celebrate our survival of high school's first year. We weren't the party types, Brooklyn and I. While many of our classmates were no doubt heading off to raucous end-of-year parties, we craved something different. The quiet of nature, the thrill of adventure, and most importantly, time alone together, away from the pressures of school and family. As we were loading up my car with camping gear, my friend Jake approached us. "Hey man," he said, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "I heard you guys are going camping. Any chance I could tag along?" I glanced at Brooklyn, seeing a flicker of disappointment cross her face before she masked it with a smile. We had planned for this to be just the two of us, but Jake was a good friend, and I couldn't bring myself to turn him away. "Sure," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "The more the merrier, right?" Brooklyn nodded in agreement, though I could tell she was less than thrilled about the change in plans. The drive to the campsite was filled with excited chatter and the kind of carefree laughter that only comes with the start of summer vacation. As we wound our way through increasingly rural roads, the landscape changed from suburban sprawl to dense forest. The trees seemed to press in on either side of the road, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns on the asphalt. We arrived at the campsite just as the sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. The site was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a fire pit at its center and enough flat ground for our tents. As Brooklyn and Jake began to set up the tents, I volunteered to gather firewood. "I'll be back in a bit," I called over my shoulder, grabbing a flashlight from the car. "Don't have too much fun without me." I set off into the woods, the sounds of my friends' laughter fading behind me. The forest was alive with the chirping of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. As I walked, picking up suitable pieces of wood, I found myself wandering further and further from the campsite. About a mile out, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I paused, my arms full of firewood, and looked around. The trees stood silent and still, no sign of movement or life. And yet, The feeling persisted. That's when I saw it. A treehouse perched about 30 feet up in a massive oak tree. Curiosity overcame my unease, and I approached the base of the tree. A rope ladder hung down, swaying slightly in the breeze. Without really thinking about it, I set down my firewood and began to climb. I was about halfway up when disaster struck. The old rope, weakened by years of exposure to the elements, suddenly gave way. "Oh, shit!" I yelled as I fell, landing hard on the forest floor. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I lay there, gasping for breath. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree. My heart began to race, adrenaline flooding my system. I reached for the revolver I always carried, a gift from my father, who insisted I needed protection in the woods, my hand shaking as I pulled it from its holster. Pressed against the trunk of the tree, I held my breath, straining my ears to track the movement of whatever was out there. The footsteps grew closer, and then silence. The quiet was somehow worse than the sound of approach, leaving me to imagine all sorts of horrors lurking just out of sight. Gathering my courage, I slowly peeked around the trunk of the tree. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. Standing there, not 10 feet away, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with the body of an emaciated deer standing upright on 2 legs. Its skin was a sickly gray, pulled tight over protruding bones and stringy muscle. But it was the face that truly terrified me. A deer's skull, bleached white by the sun, with empty sockets that somehow managed to glow with an unholy white light. I knew in that moment that I was face to face with something not of this world. The rational part of my mind shut down, leaving only primal fear and the instinct to survive. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the creature and I remained locked in a terrifying standoff. I didn't dare move, barely allowing myself to breathe, for fear of provoking an attack. And then, it spoke. "Let me up, bro," came a voice that sounded eerily like my sister's. I felt my blood run cold. How could this thing know about my sister? And why did it sound so much like her? "Come on, bro," the voice continued, an unnatural whine creeping into its tone. "Don't leave me down here." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. My sister never called me bro. This had to be some kind of trick. But how? And why? For what felt like an eternity, the creature continued its vocal mimicry. It cycled through voices, my sister, my parents, even Brooklyn. Each imitation was perfect, and yet somehow wrong, like listening to a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. "Baby, please," Brooklyn's voice cooed from the monster's maw. "I'm scared down here. Why won't you help me?" I gripped my revolver tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I knew it wasn't really Brooklyn. She was safe back at the campsite with Jake. But the sound of her voice, twisted by this abomination, sent shivers down my spine. After what must have been an hour of this psychological torture, I finally worked up the courage to look again. The creature was still there, its glowing eyes fixed directly on my hiding spot. It was as if it could see right through the tree trunk, right into my soul. In that moment, terror and desperation overwhelmed me. Without thinking, I raised my revolver and fired. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the quiet of the forest, and the creature let out a scream that was like nothing I've ever heard before. A mix of animal rage and human agony that seemed to pierce right through me. The monster turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush with inhuman speed. The sound of its retreat faded into the distance, leaving me alone in the sudden, oppressive silence of the forest. The adrenaline that had been keeping me alert suddenly drained away, leaving me exhausted and shaken. I slumped against the tree, my revolver falling from my nerveless fingers. Before I knew it, I had drifted into an uneasy sleep. I awoke to the feeling of gentle hands shaking me and the sound of familiar voices calling my name. Opening my eyes, I found myself not in the treehouse, but in a forest ranger's watchtower. Brooklyn, Jake, and a forest ranger were looking down at me with concern etched on their faces. Where am I? I mumbled, still groggy and disoriented. Where's that thing? The dead deer? Brooklyn exchanged a worried glance with Jake before leaning down to kiss me softly. You're safe now, she said, her voice soothing. We found you passed out in the woods. There was no deer, no monster. You must have had a nightmare. But I knew it wasn't a nightmare. The terror had been too real, the details too vivid. Even now, I could still hear the creature's mimicry of Brooklyn's voice, still see those glowing eyes boring into me. To this day, I've never seen that thing again. But I know it's out there, somewhere in the deep, dark woods. And I know that someday, somehow, our paths will cross again. Until then, I'll carry the memory of that night with me, a chilling reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the unwary,